When we think about ourselves and our own place in history in a particular time and a particular place, most of us are just being carried along by history. We absorb the culture and the values of a particular place and a particular time. We take the jobs that are available to us. History shapes us. But some historians talk about a great person theory in history. Sometimes people come along and based upon their own will, their own charisma, their own cunning intelligence, they don't let history shape them. Rather, they shape history, and they turn history in a particular direction, a direction that they want it to go. When historians try to identify people who meet this description, there are a wide variety of people. There are religious leaders, founders of religions, the Buddha, Mohammed, Jesus, Moses, Martin Luther. There are also the great statesmen, Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln from our own country's history. There are the great military leaders, Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte. There are the great civil rights activists, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. And then there are also evil people, Adolf Hitler. These are all people who did not let history shape them, but rather they shaped history. Today's lecture is about one of these individuals who fits the great person theory of history. He was an individual who came along and was not really somebody who was going to let history happen to him, but rather was going to turn history in a particular direction, and he did. He unified Germany. So love him or hate him, students, here's the story of Otto von Bismarck. Enjoy. All right, students, let us learn the story of Otto von Bismarck and how this one individual unified Germany. Otto von Bismarck was from the Junker class in Prussian society. You remember that a Junker was a Prussian aristocrat. As a young man, he was known for being a little wild and rambunctious. When he went to a university, he did join a Burschenschaft. But the failed revolutions of 1848 disillusioned Otto von Bismarck of any idealistic Republican revolution. He did not believe in any groundswell of people wanting to fight for their freedom, actually being able to achieve real freedoms. And Bismarck adapted a very practical, logical, rational way of achieving goals. If ever you are interested in studying political science, Bismarck is a good guy to study. First of all, he has a couple of great quotes, such as this one. Politics is the art of the possible. And isn't that a great way to think of politics? You know, what do you want to change in the world? How do you want to make things better? Well, you can through legislative reform and politics. Politics is the art of the possible, but there's successful politics and there's unsuccessful politics. And what Bismarck gives us is a methodology of achieving specific goals, of being politically successful. The term, and this is a very important term in our study of European history, the term that's used to describe Otto von Bismarck's politics is this, realpolitik. Realpolitik is a German word, but it's pretty close to a cognate for us here in English. Real as in reality, and then politik as in politics, the politics of reality. Now let me give you actually an official definition here. Isn't this nice? I usually just give you my own little personal definition or description of a term. I thought in this particular case, I'll give you a real definition. So thank you to the Oxford Dictionary for this one. Realpolitik is defined as a system of politics or principles based upon practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. Okay, to say it again, a system of politics or principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. Okay, so A system of politics or principles, that would be a way of thinking, a way of decision making based upon what actually works rather than what's morally right or what's right based upon, well, any other way of thinking, any other principles. So it's decision making based upon what's practical and what's going to work. Okay, so now here's how I think of realpolitik. It's this very cold, rational, logical, and also teleological way of thinking. By teleological, I mean you've got this end goal that's far away, and what decisions do you make in the short term to help you achieve that long-term goal? Okay, so here's how you can personally think using this realpolitik ethos. Think about what you want your life to be like in 10 years. Where do you want to be in 10 years? Okay, once you set that end point in mind, what decisions do you make now to achieve that end goal? So I've got this image of a chess set up here. Thinking in realpolitik is a little bit like playing chess. You're going to have to make some moves here to achieve this goal a little bit further on down the road. And it's the first moves of the pawns and such, they don't really matter as much as so long as you achieve that checkmate later on down the road. So, going back to this thought experiment, where do you want to be 10 years from now? Okay. Now, keeping that goal in mind, what decisions can you make today, this week, this year, in order to achieve that long-term goal? Now, if you have that long-term goal in mind, it might start altering your decision-making for what you're going to do this weekend. I think for most of us, this is a difficult way to think because we deal with problems and opportunities really on a moment-by-moment basis, and we respond to them as such. I think it is the exceptional person who thinks in this realpolitik way, where when they're in a particular situation, they think to themselves, how can I manipulate this situation to achieve a goal much further on down the line? What decisions do I make now that will help me out in the future? Okay, so there's a definition in my description of realpolitik. As we apply it to Otto von Bismarck, you can apply it really simply by going into this knowing that his goal is going to be to unify Germany, to create Germany. And you'll see Otto von Bismarck make decisions that are very unpopular and or highly controversial in the short term, only to achieve this amazing goal in the long term. And I think that's what we can take away from the story of Otto von Bismarck. Whether you like what he does or if you don't like what he does, just this way of thinking, this way of approaching problems, I do think it's rather exceptional. I don't think that most of us think like this. All right, so let's get to the story. The story really begins in the year 1861 when the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, or Friedrich Wilhelm IV, abdicated the throne because of mental instability. This is the same Frederick William IV who 13 years earlier had rejected being the first German emperor when the Frankfurt Parliament offered him a crown. They offered him to be the king of the Germans, and he said, no, I cannot accept a crown from the gutter. And wow, had he not made that decision, we wouldn't be having this lecture right here. We'd be talking about the Germany that was created out of the 1848 revolutions. And we might have a very different history because of that. Okay, but 1861 is where we're at now. Frederick Wilhelm IV, mentally unstable, abdicates the throne, and his younger brother, Wilhelm I, takes the throne. And Wilhelm I selects as his chancellor, the chancellor is like a prime minister, Otto von Bismarck. And Otto von Bismarck makes it his goal to strengthen the state of Prussia, to make Prussia a formidable power on par with France or Britain. And an essential part of that goal is unifying the German states under Prussian leadership and creating Germany. His inaugural speech as the Prussian chancellor is probably his most famous speech, out of which comes a phrase eternally associated with Otto von Bismarck and German unification. Let's take a look at this speech. The speech gives us a good insight into the mind of Otto von Bismarck and how he thinks about the state of Europe as Europe goes into the second half of the 19th century. Okay, here's what he says. The position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength and hold it for the favorable moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. But by iron and blood. Okay, so this is sometimes referred to as the blood and iron speech, and a nice sort of really simplistic way to think about the unification of Germany is that Germany was created by blood and iron. Okay, so let's just take a few seconds here to unpack this speech. Right from the get-go, he says, the greatness of Prussia is not going to be determined by liberalism, but rather by power. So liberal reform, more people having the right to vote, the growing socialist movement, the revolutionary ideals of the early 19th century. These methods are not the way forward because they don't work. Then he says, we are Prussians and we have an opportunity here. We have a favorable moment at this point in time in history. We've had moments where we could have been great, but those moments all came and went. Now is our time. I think he's speaking sort of vaguely here in this way that's very optimistic. If you're a Prussian, you're like, okay, this is a great moment. Now, what makes this particular moment, 1861, great? I don't really think there's anything special about 1861 other than Bismarck pumping up his audience, that possibly their moment of greatness has arrived. The next part of the speech, he attacks Clemens von Metternich's Concert of Europe, identifying correctly that the German states were set up to be weak intentionally, and now we're going to get rid of that. And then he finishes it off by saying, not through speeches and majority decisions, that's liberalism, will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the mistake of the revolutions of 1848, but rather the future and the greatness of our country will be determined by iron and blood. Okay, what does he mean by this? Well, iron implies industrial development and blood implies war. So the blood and iron speech. If you speak a little German, iron is Eisen and blood is Blut. So this is the Blut und Eisen speech. Okay, so as we talk about Prussia and Bismarck and what he's going to do to create Germany, it helps to understand the structure of the Prussian government because they did actually maintain a constitution after the revolutions of 1848. And understanding this government, the structure of the government, helps us to understand why Bismarck does some of the things that he does. Okay, so here's how the Prussian government was structured. So you've got a king, and the king has the power over the military. So the king can declare war. He does not need the support of the people or the people's representatives. He can unilaterally declare war. So the king has that power. So understand that the king has hired Otto von Bismarck. So pretty much Otto von Bismarck can convince the king to declare war. That's one power that he has. It's ultimately the king that has to declare it, not Otto von Bismarck, but if the king trusts Otto von Bismarck, he'll do it. Okay, then there's the Reichstag. The Reichstag, that's a word we'll hear a couple times in European history, or more than a couple times. The Reichstag is the Prussian parliament, and the Reichstag has legislative and financial power. Okay, so first of all, the structure of the parliament is interesting. It's complicated. I can't really explain it, but in Prussia, there is universal male suffrage. Any man over the age of 21 can vote. How about that? That's one of the reforms that came out of 1848. It's interesting. But it's different from like the universal suffrage that we have here in the United States where every vote is equal. There was sort of a class system that was established in Prussia. There were 3 classes of men, and these classes of men were based upon the personal wealth that you had. And that class system influenced the amount of representation the people had in the Reichstag. So obviously, the poorer classes, even though they have the right to vote, they have limited representation in parliament, and the wealthier have much more influence. They have much more representation in their parliament, in the Reichstag. So, and students, that's about as detailed as I can explain it. I'm sure there's some serious math that goes into how many men are voting in which class and then what percentage of representation they get in the Reichstag. I'm not getting into that. Just suffice it to say that everybody has the right to, every man over the age of 21 has the right to vote in Prussia. However, not all of those votes are equal. The wealthier men, their votes count more and they have better representation in the Prussian parliament, which is called the Reichstag. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, but back to the structure of government, it's this Reichstag that has the power to make laws, and they also have the power of the purse strings. So, very similar to the American Congress. The Reichstag makes the laws, and then they control the treasury, which means they determine when and how money gets spent and also how money gets collected, taxes. Okay, so Bismarck, he works for the king. He does not work for the Reichstag. So this is the situation that he's in. And as he embarks on his quest to strengthen Prussia and unify Germany, he's going to have to find a way to get the Reichstag to play ball with him. Okay. So just remember that the Junkers are the aristocrats of Prussia, and most of them are officers in the Prussian military. In the late 19th century, Germany is growing increasingly industrialized, and as Germany industrializes, they're going through the same thing that Britain has gone through during their industrialization process. And I'm saying Germany here. This is Prussia and the German states. They're growing increasingly urbanized, more and more people moving into the cities, more people working in the factories. There are all of these economic and social ills that are associated with this. So increasingly there is a movement for more labor unions and for more socialist legislation that will regulate business and industry for the benefit of the workers. Okay, the reason why Wilhelm I appointed Bismarck to be chancellor is because these two men share the same values. Wilhelm I also wants for Prussia to be a strong, powerful, and conservative European state. So for our study of Otto von Bismarck, I've tried to break down Bismarck's moves into 5 specific steps that he took to create Germany. And so I hope this makes it a little easier for you, because Otto von Bismarck's a very complex individual, and how Germany is created is very difficult to understand. So hopefully this helps us out. I'm going to talk about these 5 things that he does. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when we get to the 5th step, we have Germany. All right, so let's do it. Step 1 involves taxation. So in the early 1860s, when Otto von Bismarck became the Chancellor of Prussia, there was a problem in that the population of Prussia was growing and growing and growing, but the size of the military was staying the same. And the army is shackled by a limited amount of money that it receives from the Prussian government. So in other words, if the military is going to grow, to have more men with more uniforms, with more guns, more bullets, more training facilities, on and on, it needs to raise taxes. Okay, but the king can't do this, only the Reichstag can. And here's where we remember the king's in charge of the military, and the Reichstag's in charge of legislation and controlling the treasury. There were tax reform laws that were presented, in other words, legislation to raise taxes for the military, but those laws were not passed. So in other words, the army is not going to receive any more money, and it needs money if it is going to grow. Okay, so here's where Bismarck makes his first move. It's always fun to think about, what would you do if you were Otto von Bismarck? What would you do if you were in this situation? You need to grow your military, but the Reichstag isn't passing laws to tax the people more so that you can grow the military. So if it's your job to grow the military, what are you going to do? So it's just fun to think about, what do you do at this moment? How do you keep your king, Wilhelm I, happy? He wants a powerful military too. All right. Well, here's what Bismarck did. In Bismarck's mind, if he's reading the sentiment of the people of Prussia correctly, Prussian people love their military. And if they see their military, there's a sense of pride and a sense that they want to take care of the military. So Bismarck simply dispatches the military throughout Prussia to collect taxes from each town. So no law was passed, but because Bismarck and the king, they're the ones that control the military and can tell the military what to do. They're the commanders-in-chief. The king's the commander-in-chief. Bismarck just tells Wilhelm, tell the military to go collect those taxes anyway. Each town owes a certain amount of taxes. Send the military to each town to collect the taxes, because the people will not pay the taxes when the military is right there and they have to look them in the eye. So Bismarck does this. It's illegal. It totally works. And essentially what he's telling the Reichstag is, it doesn't really matter what you do, we're collecting the taxes. We need a strong Prussian military. All right, so there's step 1. And Prussia is creating a strong military based upon its population. It's getting money and men now. Hey, and the other thing that the Prussian military can do at this point in time is buy more guns, bullets, cannon, etc. Prussia, or rather in Prussia, there is one of the most famous arms manufacturers in the entire world, and it was run by the Krupp family. Krupp is spelled K-R-U-P-P, the Krupp family. And the Prussian and later German military will rely heavily upon the arms of Krupp. All right, just throwing that in there. Okay, step 1, done. Let's move on to step 2. Step 2 is Poland. All right, Poland is right next door to Prussia. Poland is not really Poland, it's part of Russia, but in December of 1863, going into January of 1864, we have the January Uprising. Again, all Polish uprisings are named after months because this is about how long they last. So this is the January Uprising. This is January of 1864. Okay, and the Polish people are rising up at this point in time in history because the Tsar of Russia is Tsar Alexander II. He's the Tsar reformer. He's the Tsar who liberated the serfs. So because Tsar Alexander II tips liberal, the people of Poland think, okay, now's our opportunity, and there is this uprising. And the goal of this uprising is, of course, to create Poland. It's a nationalist movement. Around Western Europe, France and Britain in particular, support the Polish people. They support the Polish people for ideological reasons. Polish people deserve to go free. They deserve to have their own country. And also because they don't like Russia. This is the decade following the Crimean War. And so people like Napoleon III and Queen Victoria make statements that are in support of the Polish people. Now, this is happening right next door to Prussia. Bismarck, with his realpolitik mind, looks at this situation. This situation has just popped up. He didn't plan for this situation, but it's happening. It's happening pretty close by. And he thinks to himself, how can we exploit this situation for our benefit? So he's not thinking, oh, the poor people of Poland, yes, they deserve to have their own country. It's wrong how the Russian people have oppressed them for so long. He doesn't think like that. He doesn't think in terms of what's morally right. He thinks, how can I exploit this situation for our benefit? So what's the goal? What's the end result that we're shooting for? Well, the empowerment of Prussia and the creation of a German state. Now, Bismarck knows that, just like when Frederick the Great started strengthening Prussia, as soon as he starts to unite the German states under Prussia, all the other neighbors are going to get really nervous because here comes Prussia. They're going to try to take over some of our lands. They're going to disrupt the balance of power. So he knows that other countries like France, Austria, and Russia, they're going to get nervous as Prussia strengthens itself. So, knowing that, Otto von Bismarck thinks, is there any way I can use this situation to my favor? And I think he's pretty much got 3 options here. The first option is to do nothing, just let whatever happens next door in Poland happen. It's really not their business anyway, as Prussians. So you just let him be. Or 2, he could support the Prussian uprising. He could send Prussian troops into Poland next door and support the Polish people in their valiant and noble quest to achieve freedom. That's option number 2. The third option is to send Prussian troops in to support the Russian troops to crush the Polish uprising. So that's option number 3. And so thinking of those 3 options, he wonders what will be best for Prussia. And so again, just take a moment, think of what you would do. Although with this slide up here, I pretty much identify what Otto von Bismarck does, which is the third thing. He sends Prussian troops in to support the Russian troops to put down the put down the Polish uprising. Now, why would he do that? Well, he did it because he felt there was more of a benefit of supporting the Russians and putting the Russians in a state of indebtedness to the Prussians. So from here on out, as Otto von Bismarck makes his big moves, Tsar Alexander II and the Russian people are just going to let Prussia do whatever it is Prussia wants to do. And that was Otto von Bismarck's second move in the strengthening of Prussia and the creation of the German state. All right. Number 3, Denmark. Okay, in 1864, Denmark had recently rewritten its constitution. It had already established a constitutional monarchy and was one of the most liberal countries in Europe in terms of people having representation in their own government, and the monarch having limited power. And in this new constitution in 1864, Denmark officially absorbed the northern German states of Schleswig and Holstein. Now, this is complicated. This whole story and the cause of the Danish-Prussian War of 1864 is very complicated, and I certainly don't even understand all of the details. I don't even think people at the time really understood a lot of the details. But so let me just stick with sort of the general description of what's going on here. I think this is safest. All right, so Schleswig and Holstein were not, prior to 1864, part of Denmark. However, in Schleswig and Holstein, these two northern German states, there were plenty of both Danish-speaking people and German-speaking people. And after 1848, Denmark was effectively assisting in the governance of Schleswig and Holstein. So it sort of seemed that prior to 1864, Schleswig and Holstein were pretty much already Denmark. The new Constitution of 1864 just simply made it official. Okay, so interesting. So enter Bismarck. All right, Bismarck. What are you going to do about the situation? And just sort of like the situation in Poland, he looks at it and thinks, all right, this is going on near our border. Is there anything I can do about it to manipulate the situation for our benefit? Now, the situation's different from Poland because Poland, there was an uprising. There's already a conflict. There's no conflict going on here, at least none that I've ever heard of. This is simply a constitutional change, and essentially Denmark is absorbing Schleswig and Holstein into Denmark. Pretty simple. So it seems like Bismarck has really two moves that he could possibly make. One is do nothing. You probably guess he's not going to do nothing unless that somehow serves his purpose. Or get involved and say, no, Denmark, you don't have the right to claim these two German states. Okay, how he handles this situation, there's many parts to it. For Bismarck, going into this, he doesn't really care much at all about Denmark and this whole situation. He essentially wants to use a war against Denmark to keep Schleswig and Holstein free as a catalyst to start other wars that will enable him to unite Germany under Prussian leadership. Okay, so let me do my best to help set this up. Okay, so here's what Bismarck does. If you can, take a moment and look at this map of Europe right here. It's a fairly accurate map in terms of what Europe looked like in 1864. So find Prussia, find Denmark. Otto von Bismarck is going to make the case that Denmark is acting in an aggressive and hostile manner, and that they have no right to claim these two states which belong to the German Confederation. Now, Prussia, as an act of good faith, is not going to act unilaterally in the invasion of Denmark and the liberation of Schleswig and Holstein. So Otto von Bismarck and the Prussians invite, here we go, the Austrians to join in this military campaign of liberating Schleswig and Holstein. So the Prussian military is going to go in, the Austrian military is going to go in this war against Denmark in 1864. Okay, so little Denmark versus Prussia and Austria. I bet you can guess who wins this war. Denmark is soundly defeated. Okay, but before the battles begin, Otto von Bismarck reached out diplomatically to several other states. He reached out both officially, and with others he reached out secretively. Again, he's sort of setting up the next phase of uniting the German people. So the first group that he goes to is the government of the German Confederation. And prior to the invasion of Denmark and the liberation of Schleswig and Holstein, he has the German Confederation agree that they are not going to be part of this military campaign and that they are not to be involved in it at all, that this is something that Prussia and Austria are going to do exclusively by themselves. And the German Confederation agrees to this. The German Confederation is out. They are not to get involved. They are to mind their own business. Okay. Next, Otto von Bismarck engages in secret diplomatic talks with Napoleon III. Hey, and by the way, Otto von Bismarck, when he spoke to Napoleon III, he spoke to him in French. Otto von Bismarck was fluent in French and spoke to Napoleon III in his own language. And in his secret diplomacy with Napoleon III, Otto von Bismarck says this: Napoleon, if Prussia and Austria should go to war, I would like for you to stay out of it. And if you stay out of it, then we will help you, France, secure some German land in a region called the Rhineland. And the Rhineland is simply on the eastern border of France. It's called the Rhineland because the Rhine River flows through it. There's a lot of coal in the Rhineland. It's a great industrial area. And there are also a lot of vineyards on the Rhineland too. So France could profit from expanding these borders, or expanding their border, and taking over the Rhineland area. And Otto von Bismarck is making this promise to Napoleon III, you can have the Rhineland, we'll help you get it if you just mind your own business if Prussia and Austria go to war in the future. And Napoleon agrees to this. But Napoleon III he's sort of a sly dude in his own way as well. After having this meeting, he reached out secretively to the Austrian government to strike a deal with them because Napoleon, he thinks, okay, Otto von Bismarck seems like he might be trying to start a war with Austria. If that's so, I, Napoleon III, think that Austria is going to win that war. They've got the stronger military capability. So Napoleon III, when he reaches out to the Austrian government, says, if you guys should fight a war against Prussia, I would like to send my troops into the German states of the Rhineland and take them over. So it seems like I'm threatening Prussia too. And the Austrians agree to this. So Napoleon III is sort of playing both sides. But either way, if there's a war between Prussia and Austria, France is going to stay out of it, but they are going to send their troops into the Rhineland, which might make it seem like they're joining in the fight. Okay. The next secret act of diplomacy that Otto von Bismarck engages in is with the Venetians. Okay, the Venetians. So once again, I try to circle the region I'm talking about here on the map. So there up on the top of the Adriatic Sea, there's Venetia with its capital city of Venice. We talked about this region for a long time here in European history. Okay, remember that when Italy unified, or at least almost completely unified, with Cavour and Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel, that Venetia remained part of the Austrian Empire. Venetia did not unite with the rest of Italy. And the other part was Rome. Rome did not unite either because you've got French troops protecting the Pope in Rome. So Bismarck reaches down to the government of Venetia. This is a secret diplomatic mission. And he says to the government in Venetia, should there be war between Prussia and Austria, this will be your opportunity to go free. When our two countries go to war, you, Venetia, are to rise up in rebellion and declare your independence and your freedom. And should Austria try to take you back, the Prussians will invade Austria. In other words, Prussia will help you win your independence. Okay, so that's the setup. There's a lot going on there, but hopefully you'll see how this makes sense once things get going. Knowing that background and knowing all those things that Otto von Bismarck did at the advent of the Danish-Prussian War, it sort of helps you understand how the dominoes fall the way that they do immediately following the Danish-Prussian War of 1864. All right, so here's what goes down. The combined Austrian and Prussian armies go into Schleswig and Holstein. They liberate them from the Danes. They easily win the war. Afterwards, the Austrians are placed in charge of the governance of Holstein. The Prussians are placed in the governance of Schleswig. So there are Prussian troops that are moving through Holstein, which is controlled by the Austrians, as they go up into Schleswig. And sometimes these troops are moving over land, and sometimes they're coming in through the port of Kiel, which you can't see on this map because one of the circles is over it. But you have Prussians moving through Holstein. Bismarck sends out an order to the military commanders, who in turn instruct their troops to begin harassing the Austrians. This is a vague order open to a lot of interpretation, but harass the Austrian troops. Beat them up, steal their food, make fun of them, whatever. Harass the Austrian troops. The Austrian troops get very annoyed with this, their commanders get very annoyed with this, they appeal to the Prussian commanders, please instruct your Prussian soldiers to quit harassing the Austrian soldiers. Well, that request gets completely ignored, and the Austrians are very frustrated with the Prussians, so instead of just going to war with the Prussians or something like that, and it's going to be a really silly reason to go to war, they simply look to a third party to help arbitrate these conflicts that are going on between the Prussian troops and the Austrian troops. They want an independent third party to make sure that everybody is nice to everybody else. And so the Austrians turn to the German Confederation. Now, because Austria has reached out to the German Confederation and asked them to now be involved in the governance of Schleswig-Holstein, and because the German Confederation had previously agreed that they would stay out of the governance of Schleswig-Holstein, Otto von Bismarck uses this as a pretext for war, and war is declared on Austria. When this happened, Austria sought the support of several northern German states like Hanover and Westphalia, and those German states joined Austria in their war against Prussia, and this is the fourth move that Otto von Bismarck makes. War against Austria. So the first thing Bismarck and the Prussians do when the northern German states, who are allied with Austria, also declare war on Prussia, Prussia goes and invades them and takes them over. Prussia is now expanding into Northern Europe, or the Northern German Confederation. Napoleon III begins making preparation to send troops into the Rhineland, and down south in Venetia, the Venetians are rising up. The big conflict between Prussia and Austria will culminate with one big battle, the Battle of Königsgrätz. This particular battle took place in the Austrian Empire, not too far away from Prague. What the German-speaking people called Königsgrätz is actually a Czech town. And here, this is the big culminating battle, the Prussians soundly defeat the Austrians. And one of the reasons why the Prussians won, maybe a principal reason why they won, is because they had a new gun. It was a breech-loading gun called the needle gun. Breech-loading meaning you could load the bullets from the back. So whereas the Austrians had to stand up to put in the bullet and tamp it down with the rod, the Prussians could lay down on the ground and essentially shoot the Austrians as they stood up to load their rifles. The breech-loading gun was simply more efficient, thus enabling the Prussian military to be safer and to move more quickly across the battlefield. Now, at this particular battle, the Battle of Königsgrätz, both King Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck were there. And when Königsgrätz was won, and the Austrians are on the run, Wilhelm I realizes, I could capture Austria. I could capture all of Austria. Vienna is mine for the taking. Now, Wilhelm I is the commander-in-chief of the Prussian military. If he wants to send the Prussian military into Vienna, he can. But Bismarck tells him, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And Wilhelm I is like, why not? We can take Vienna. We can unite Prussia with Austria. Bismarck says, don't do that. And Bismarck counsels against it because for Bismarck and his military and political strategy, you always want victories that can come quick. So Bismarck initiated a lot of wars, but his wars were really kind of short and sweet, and they secured victory for Prussia. And he saw Austria as a big headache. Even though you can take Austria, it doesn't mean that you should take it. You're going to have to deal with all of those minority groups that are going to go free, the Czechs, the Croatians, the Hungarians, all of them. And that's going to create a mess in Eastern Europe. And then maybe the Austrian people don't really want you ruling them. Then you're going to deal with subversives in Austria. So Bismarck counsels Wilhelm, no, don't take Vienna. And this gnawed at Wilhelm. He's like, Prussia taking over Austria. Imagine what a country. Bismarck says, no, it would not be a great country. It would be a mess. You don't want to deal with it. Let's stick with the people who we can unite with Prussia, the German Confederation. All right. In 1864, a couple big things happened. Poor Austria is losing a lot of power and influence. People of Venetia, they did rise up. They did break off from the Austrian Empire, and they unite with the rest of Italy, leaving the only part of Italy in 1866. The only part of Italy that's not technically part of Italy is Rome, where you still have the French army guarding the Pope. All right. The other part of Austria and the Austrian Empire that rose up was Hungary. So the Hungarians saw the defeat of the Austrian military at Königsgrätz in Bohemia, today's Czech Republic. That was for them their inspiration to rise up and to create their own country, sort of. So Hungary is going to become its own country, sort of. Here is politically what happened. We have the establishment of what I have labeled on this slide here as the dual monarchy. It is also the creation of what we will call from here on out the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was established in 1867. The political setup is like this. Hungary is its own country in terms of its legislation and its governance, but it will have as its king the Emperor of Austria. So this is Franz Joseph, who you may remember rose to power in the 1848 revolutions. So this is what makes this region a dual monarchy. Both the Austrian Empire and Hungary will share the same emperor. So Franz Joseph is both the emperor of the Austrian Empire and he is the king of Hungary. Also, the Austro-Hungarian Empire will share the same military and the same currency. So same money, same military, same king. In every other way, Hungary is free. So they've got their own schools, they've got their own legislation, and they're doing their own thing. But from here on out, from 1867 all the way through World War I, where the whole thing finally collapses, there is now technically no longer an Austrian Empire that includes Hungary. There is now the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or we can just abbreviate it to Austria-Hungary. All right, also because of the war, the Austro-Prussian War, many of those northern German states, like Hanover and Westphalia, that had sided with the Austrians, they are now taken over by the Prussians, and we have the establishment of the North German Confederation. Prussia is expanding, and the nice thing for these states, these northern German states that are now part of Prussia, they're going to have the same governance, there's going to be the same economic system, same currency, the same military. They will all begin to profit from being part of this expanding Prussian kingdom. All right, and those are 4 out of the 5 moves. The 5th move involves that great rival of the German people, the French. Bismarck's 5th move is against France, and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 will create the German Empire. All right, so let's learn about it. So Bismarck's thinking that he can use the German animosity toward the French as a uniting cause to bring the German people together under Prussian leadership to create the German state. Now, most of the animosity that the German-speaking people have towards the French goes back to the French Revolution and especially Napoleon, who of course conquered the German-speaking people, all of them, Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, Austria. He conquered them all, right? And then after the Napoleonic era, you saw the rise of the German nationalist movement, the Burschenschaften, all that stuff. There's this anger toward the French. And so Bismarck doesn't think he can just declare war against the French. He has to somehow entice Napoleon III to declare war against him or any of the German states. Because, man, if Napoleon III does that, Napoleon III invading the German-speaking lands, then all the German people are going to come together to defend themselves against the French, because this is another Napoleon invading from France to take them over. So this is where Bismarck becomes a little bit of a psychologist, because he's like, all right, I know that Napoleon III has an ego. He wants to be seen as the most important and powerful monarch in all of Europe. He's had this since 1848. He wants to be his uncle. So Bismarck's just doing something. He's waiting for something that he can somehow manipulate to get Napoleon III to declare war on Prussia or the German states or something. Anything to make Napoleon III look like an aggressor. All right, and that event comes in the year 1868 in Madrid, Spain. Down in the Spanish capital, the Queen of Spain, Queen Isabella II, had been driven out of power for being a bad queen. And down in Spain, Leopold Hohenzollern, who had married into the Spanish royal line, was offered the Spanish crown. He could be the king of Spain. Now remember, the Hohenzollerns, that's the Prussian royal family line. So like Wilhelm I is a Hohenzollern, Frederick the Great was a Hohenzollern. This is a Prussian who has been offered the Spanish crown to be king of Spain. All right, so this situation in 1868 makes Napoleon III a little nervous because it's sort of the classic French thing, right? You feel like you're surrounded by powerful German states on either side. I mean, take this all the way back to the Renaissance, and you had the Valois kings like Francis I, who were like, oh, the Habsburgs, they're over there. And the German states, they're down there in Spain. The Habsburgs, they're everywhere. And now it's Napoleon III. It's the late 1860s. And he's like, well, now it's the Hohenzollerns. The Hohenzollerns are over there in Prussia. They are down there in Spain. And so Napoleon III is mildly concerned about this situation. So how Napoleon III decides to deal with it is to send a diplomat directly to Wilhelm I. So Napoleon III was probably very wise in this. He bypassed Otto von Bismarck and goes directly to the King of Prussia. And the diplomat asks the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, who was actually in a place called Bad Ems, we'll talk about that in a second, but the diplomat asked the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, whether or not there were any plans to unite Spain with Prussia, or would he agree that Spain and Prussia would remain two distinct independent states. And Wilhelm I told the ambassador that Prussia had no interest in uniting politically with Spain. Diplomat goes back to Napoleon and reports to him that Wilhelm I has said, privately and confidentially, Prussia has no interest in Spain, France is all right. All right. Bismarck finds out about this interaction, and he is very upset. If you're not familiar with German, Scheiße means, oh shoot, in German, because for Bismarck, this was an opportunity to goad Napoleon III into war. If Napoleon III felt that Prussia and Spain were going to unite, then he would declare war against Prussia and or Spain. Bismarck's like, oh, I missed an opportunity. And I'm sure in the back of his mind, he was thinking, come on, King, you know that I'm smarter than you. Don't make decisions like this without me. Bismarck just reeling with the fact that he missed this opportunity. But, as luck and chance would have it for Bismarck, the government in France had a problem with the transaction that just occurred between the French diplomat and the Prussian king. And so this is the French legislature. They were concerned about this diplomatic interaction. And their concern was it was private. It was sort of a gentleman's agreement. It was the King of Prussia saying, Prussia and Spain are going to remain two independent states. But the fact that it was said privately, it didn't sit well with the French government. And so they communicate to Napoleon III that they wanted in writing, they want an official statement from King Wilhelm I that says that he has no interest in politically unifying with Spain. That way, if ever the Spanish and the Prussians decide to do something cooperatively together in the future, Napoleon can drum up the support of the international community in Europe to fight Spain or Prussia or whatever. But anyway, the French government felt it was in France's best interest to get this official statement made, that this wasn't just going to be a quiet gentleman's agreement. So Napoleon III communicated to Wilhelm I that he needed to produce an official statement. So Bismarck hears this, and this is like manna from heaven for Otto von Bismarck, who's like, okay, you want an official statement? I can help craft an official statement. And what Bismarck wants to do is he wants to have this official statement be something that will so upset Napoleon III or make him concerned that Napoleon III will be goaded into declaring war against Prussia. Okay, so this is remembered in history as the Bad Ems telegram. So Wilhelm I was in a German city called Bad Ems. Bad is the German word for bath, and so there were these old Roman baths that were there in Bad Ems. And so it's sort of a spa resort town in the western part of Germany, not too terribly far away from the French border. So the king's there at Bad Ems, and he's asked to make an official statement about what transpired between him and the French diplomat. So he composes a statement, and he sends this statement to Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck says, I would like to read and edit this statement before it gets passed on to Napoleon III. And so Wilhelm I writes his statement about here's what happened, here's what I agreed to, sends it on to Bismarck. So here it is on the screen right here. You can pause it and read it if you want to, but it's certainly not necessary. But if you'll see, I've highlighted some things that seem to imply that there was a negative interaction between the French diplomat and the king. And so what Bismarck is going to do is he's going to take this statement and edit it, still using the words of Wilhelm I, but taking only bits of the Bad Ems telegram out of the context of the whole thing. He can make it seem like there was a very negative interaction between the diplomat and the king, which is exactly what he does. And Bismarck takes his edited version and he sends it directly to Napoleon III. So Napoleon III gets this message, which is remembered in history as the Ems telegram. And in it, it effectively says that the French diplomat did not receive the king's word, but instead was snubbed and sent away, as if the king, Wilhelm I, wanted nothing to do with the French diplomat. Napoleon III receives this telegram. He is personally insulted, and he declares war on Prussia. France versus Prussia. Now let's remember, this is the late 1860s. We're a little over a decade past the Crimean War. France is pretty respected for having a powerful military. But after the war against the Austrians, it seems like the Prussians know what they're doing too. But this seems like this is going to be an epic showdown. But all of the German states are nervous because here comes Napoleon III. So in fear of Napoleon III, and maybe also sensing which way historically the winds are blowing in the favor of Prussia, creating a strong, powerful German state, the southern German states, especially the big one, Bavaria, they sided with the Prussians to be part of the Great Franco-Prussian War of 1870. War was declared in July of 1870, and it was pretty much over by September. There was one major battle, the Battle of Sedan. It was won soundly by the Prussians, especially since Napoleon III had personally led troops in a battle, and the Prussians had captured Napoleon III. So Napoleon III meets with Otto von Bismarck, as captured here later on by this particular drawing. Prussia is getting ready to take over France at this point in time. Napoleon III realizes the truth of this situation, looks at Otto von Bismarck, and tells Otto von Bismarck this: I forgive you, but the French people never will. I forgive you, but the French people never will. This was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. France is going to be conquered by the Germans. The Germans will occupy northern France for a period of time, going into 1871 before they finally leave. The French have been humiliated. So fast forward a couple of generations later to 1914, some 45 years later, when World War I breaks out and the Germans begin their invasion of France in August of 1914, the French are seething for vengeance from this event in 1870. So this was considered a very prescient statement. I forgive you, but the French people never will. Okay, Napoleon III goes into exile, ends up in England, of course. They all end up in England. The Germans, they will occupy the northern part of France, including Paris and including Versailles, into 1871. And they will be there as the French begin the process of setting up the French Third Republic. Because the French had declared war against the Prussians, and the Prussians won the war, they claimed from France a region along the French and German border called Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine are these two regions in, well, what was France after 1870. It is now part of Germany, as Germany is being created at this point in time. It's sort of this ping pong ball that keeps going between France and Germany in history. The big capital city of Alsace-Lorraine is the city of Strasbourg. And so Alsace-Lorraine as a region is very interesting. It's got French culture, it's got German culture, and it always belongs to whoever won the last war in history. So today Alsace-Lorraine is French because the Allies won World War II. So Alsace-Lorraine went back to being part of France. After 1870, it's part of Germany because Germany is being formed. And Alsace-Lorraine is sort of a rallying cry for the French to seek vengeance on Germany. They took Alsace-Lorraine, and this is our land. So Alsace-Lorraine. I've only been to Alsace-Lorraine once in 1996 when I was traveling around Europe, and I went to the capital city of Strasbourg. It's really beautiful. It's French today, but I remember walking through the streets of downtown Strasbourg, and you see these big signs above restaurants and cafes and stuff that say, Man spricht hier Deutsch, which means we speak German here. Meaning you don't actually have to speak German to go in there, but if you do go in there, you speak, they can't speak German to you. You don't just have to speak French. Just like there might be places in the United States of America, restaurants and such where you can go in and you can speak either English or Spanish. So there's Alsace-Lorraine. Hey, the city of Strasbourg is also one of the cities that houses the European Union. Brussels is the big EU city, but Strasbourg is one too. All right, done talking about Alsace-Lorraine. Let's take it to Versailles. The German military occupied the Palace of Versailles, and it was here in the Hall of Mirrors, the most famous room in Versailles, where representatives of all of the states of the German Confederation and Prussia agreed that they all wanted to be part of the same state, the German Empire, and that King Wilhelm I of Prussia would be their emperor. The German word for emperor is similar to the Russian word for emperor. Both the Russians and the Germans use the word Caesar for an emperor. So in Russia, or in Russian, the word for Caesar is Tsar. And in German, the German word for Caesar is Kaiser. So here we are in this very famous painting of the Prussian military commanders all in their Prussian blue, swords drawn, hailing their new leader, Kaiser Wilhelm I. So as you look at this painting, the individual who's being honored is situated off to the left, and you see Kaiser Wilhelm I in his Prussian blue with the yellow sash standing on this little makeshift stage that they have. But the painter of this painting designed it like such. Your eyes can't help to drift towards the very center of the painting, where you have in all white standing out in contrast against the Prussian blue, the Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who is the real architect of the German Empire. So this German Empire is sometimes referred to in history, especially today, as the German Second Empire, meaning that the first German Empire was the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire got really weak, especially after the 30 Years' War, and then it finally collapsed in 1806 when Napoleon took it over, and then it became the German Confederation, and now the Germans are united once again, and we have the German Second Empire. Now, nobody back then was really calling it the German Second Empire. It's only because later on in history, Hitler comes along, creates his German Empire, and he calls his empire the Third Empire, or in German, the Third Reich. And many people are familiar with that phrase, the Third Reich, as Hitler's Nazi empire. And so people sometimes wonder, well, what were the previous two empires? Well, this is number two. The German Empire established in 1871, January of 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. So the German Empire was created in Versailles, at the French palace, which I'm sure that symbolically was humiliation enough for the French. But hey, we did it. Those are the 5 steps. Those are the 5 steps. But that accomplished, we are not done with Germany or France for that matter. We still have a little bit left to learn. So let's continue on. Adolf Thiers, who was there back in 1848 at the founding of the Second Republic, is appointed as the provisional president for the French Third Republic. So my title for Adolf Thiers here is a little misleading as president of the French Third Republic. He was president of the provisional government as they were creating the French Third Republic, and then when the French Third Republic came along, there was actually somebody else who became president. But Adolf Thiers is the one who's responsible for rebuilding France. And the first thing he has to deal with is Paris. There's a reason why the Germans were in Versailles outside of Paris, because Paris had essentially broken off from France and created its own country. The Germans never took Paris. As the Germans invaded, the French army retreated into Paris, set up barricades, and successfully deflected the Germans from taking over Paris. The Germans never broke the siege. I mean, they got the French government to surrender. So what do they care about the capital city of Paris? But now you have Paris. Paris never surrendered. And when the rest of France does surrender to the Germans and accepts the conditions of surrender and the establishment of the French Third Republic, the people of Paris are like, well, most of them, not all of them, many of them, they declare they simply don't want to be a part of France anymore. They want to be their own independent state. And we have, by the time we get to spring of 1871, the creation of something called the Paris Commune. All right, so why did the Parisians do this? Well, first of all, they never surrendered to the Germans. The Germans laid siege to Paris for 4 months, but they never surrendered. Then, once the government of France collapses, the soldiers are told they're not going to get paid for their service to France. And this new provisional government led by Adolf Thiers, it seems quite intent on not doing anything to support the French soldiers or the common French people. That this French Third Republic is going to be a lot like the July monarchy, and that they are going to support the rich, and we'll have this wealthy bourgeois class who are just going to go on like life as usual, like this war never even happened, and that the poor people who fought this war are just expected to go back to work and suffer through. So one of the things that really ate at a lot of the poor French people who were part of the military is that while they were gone fighting, they were expected to get paid, but when they came back and they lost the war, they didn't receive payment, and then the rents that they owed for their homes, especially their homes in Paris, the landlord still wanted the rent. There was no rent forgiveness for fighting for your country. And so there were little small things like this, and the French people, or the French soldiers in Paris said, no, we're gonna take over Paris. We're gonna run things here. And they had the guns, they're part of the French military, so they just holed up in Paris. So Adolphe Thiers has to decide what to do. Paris has barricaded itself, and inside of Paris, there's this very interesting political and social experiment going on. The Paris Commune is effectively an anarchy. There's no central government. The people of Paris are sort of starting to just take care of themselves. And so, once again, the eyes of the world start turning on Paris. Now, so some interesting things start happening in Paris. First of all, there were some French military commanders who were telling their troops, okay, we defended Paris against the Germans, good for us. Now we are part of the provisional government under Adolphe Thiers. We need to do what he tells us to do. And these French military officers were executed by their own troops because the troops wanted to join the Paris Commune. Then, not everybody in Paris is supportive of the French or the Parisian people, creating an anarchy in Paris. In particular, the wealthy. So the rich people of Paris, they're in a scary predicament. The people there might try to kill them, take their property, and redistribute the wealth. So some of the wealthy in Paris, they get hurt, they get killed. Some of them flee Paris, but even if they flee Paris, well, their stuff's all being taken over by the people in the Paris Commune. By the way, the people in the Paris Commune are called the communards. So the communards are taking over all their stuff. They support Adolphe Thiers and the French army going in and reclaiming Paris. So there was a little there. So the Paris Commune, upon its establishment, was a civil war. The communards went around destroying a lot of buildings, especially buildings, statues, and such that are symbolic of monarchs and oppressors. And so interesting, they ripped down a statue that you see here of Napoleon, like the Napoleon the First. They also destroyed this part of the royal palace in downtown Paris. This is the Tuileries Palace. The Tuileries is where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were brought to live after the Women's Bread March on Versailles in October of 1789. So this is one of the last pictures taken of the royal Tuileries Palace before the communards just destroyed it. So the surrounding part of the palace is today the Louvre. So here's a picture of the Louvre today. Of course, probably the world's most famous art museum, where the Mona Lisa is. All those Jacques-Louis David paintings, they're in here in the Louvre. Where the Tuileries Palace was in part of the tree lawn that you see in this particular image, in between where the fountain is and where the rest of the Louvre is, further away from you, if that makes any sense. But the Tuileries Palace was in here. Okay, so what happened in Paris, France in the spring of 1871 was complicated. It was very exciting. It was very dramatic. And boy, I'll do my best to both summarize and provide what I hope is a fair representation of this event, the Paris Commune. But man, it was wild. It was complicated. It's also been a fascinating source of study for many historians. I mean, a city, one of the most important cities in Europe and the world, just says we're free, we're separate, we're going to do our own thing, and they establish an anarchy. It was very exciting. It would have been a very incredible time to be alive, to live through it. And one way to look at it as this social experiment during the industrial age, or rather in an industrialized society, of trying to create essentially a revolutionary state, an anarchy. There are pictures from the Paris Commune of the communards, proud, like you see here, proudly defending the city, and of the communards destroying symbols of the old to create something new. And they did some pretty revolutionary things. They brought back the old revolutionary calendar of the French Revolution. Neither the Roman Catholic Church or any religious institution had sway or power over the education of the children in Paris or in anything related to the governance of Paris. Unpaid rent was forgiven to those soldiers who had died fighting against the Germans. A pension was provided to that soldier's family, and even to unwed partners. So if you were a woman and you had a boyfriend who was in some way taking care of you, even if you weren't married and he went off and fought and died, you received a pension. Of course, there had to be a whole organizational system established in the Paris Commune to collect money and redistribute money. There was this, and there were various forms of debt relief to the people of Paris. So Pretty much what you're looking at here is a workers' republic. This is why, of course, the rich didn't like it in Paris and why the rich fled and how some of the rich were killed. And so the communards are creating this society that elevates the status of the working class so that they are financially and socially safe. The communards did develop a flag. It is simply an all-red flag, the flag of revolution. And so when we get to the 20th century and there are these communist revolutions like in Russia and in China, their flags are simply an adaptation of the first all-red revolutionary flag that was used during the Paris Commune. Now, most of the people in Paris who were associated with the French government, they got out because they would have been scared of the Paris Commune. But there was one important political official who stayed, and this is kind of cool for us. It was the American ambassador to France. His name was Elihu Washburn, and I hope I'm pronouncing his first name correctly. I think it's Elihu Washburn. There's a name that's gone out of fashion. So this was during the President Ulysses S. Grant administration in United States history, so we're going through our Reconstruction era in the spring of 1871. And so this was a Grant appointee. He's the American ambassador to France. And when the Paris Commune broke out, he was encouraged, if not directed by the American government to leave, to get out of there. And Elihu Washburn did not. He stayed and he documented what happened during the Paris Commune. So we have this fantastic primary source written in English by an American about what went down in the Paris Commune. Washburn also served as an important political role during the Paris Commune. He was in communication with both the French government, the provisional government, and the Germans during this time. But I honestly don't know enough about how he communicated with them and the role that he played. I just think it's great that the American ambassador stayed in Paris during the Paris Commune. All right. And then for Adolf Thiers, after about 3 months of this, he wants to break Paris. So he sends in the troops. The troops approach Paris from Versailles, which is west of Paris, and they go in full force to take over the town and shoot anybody who resists. This was called the Bloody Week, La Semaine Sanglante, if my French is correct there, La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week. In comes the French army. They shoot somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 people on the streets of Paris. An estimated 3,000 to 4,000 ran away and they went to Belgium. Many of the communards who were captured, they were simply lined up against a wall and executed. And one of the famous places where these executions occurred were next to the cemetery gates of probably one of the most famous cemeteries, well, the most famous cemetery in Paris, and really one of the most famous cemeteries in the world, the Père Lachaise Cemetery in downtown Paris, which is where you are buried if you are a famous person. So some famous people who have died in Paris and been buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, the Irish playwright Oscar Wilde, who died in Paris, and also the American rock star, the singer for The Doors, Jim Morrison. He is also buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery. And it was here at the gates of Père Lachaise that many communards were just lined up and gunned down. Now, there were many famous, colorful figures who became celebrities in the Paris Commune. This is probably the most famous, this woman right here, who is still a very popular figure among the French today. And if you were growing up in France right now and learning your French history, you probably spent a little bit of time studying the life of Louise Michel. She was one of the most prominent communards. When the siege of Paris began under the Germans, Louise Michel organized a female militia called the Montmartre Women's Vigilance Committee. Montmartre is a neighborhood in Paris, very famous neighborhood in Paris. There's a lot of tourism in Montmartre. If ever you visit Paris, chances are you'll go up to the hill of Montmartre, which looks down upon the rest of Paris. All right, so the Montmartre Women's Vigilance Committee was established by Louise Michel, women in uniforms brandishing guns defending Paris, showing the world that women can fight just like men do. Now, I can't be certain of this, but from my understanding of European history, this is the first time where you have an all-female militia group. In our own country's history, women don't serve in the military in active combat roles until the 1991 Gulf War. This is 120 years before 1991. This is 1871, and Louise Michel says that a woman can do exactly what a man can do, even in this hyper-masculine role of killing. Women can be soldiers too. So that's me putting words into the mouth of Louise Michel. Here is an actual quote from Louise Michel. And most of these quotes are taken from her trial after the Paris Commune and also from her many autobiographical writings. So, but Louise Michel, "Oh, I'm a savage, all right. I like the smell of gunpowder, grape shot flying through the air, but above all, I'm devoted to the revolution." She reflected afterwards, "How many times during the Commune did I go with a National Guardsman or a soldier to some place where they hardly expected to have to contend with a woman?" Now, Louise Michel, aside from being a soldier in the Paris Commune, she also was a very active member in creating a new society, and in particular, ensuring that women had the exact same rights in society in the Paris Commune that a man had, and that also the needs of women, which are different from the needs of men, need to be protected. So, for example, Louise Michel secured during the time of the Paris Commune that women had the right to divorce a man, that they received equal pay for equal work. She also helped establish childcare facilities where women who had children and needed childcare, but they also needed to work in these facilities, the women were placed on rotation where some would drop off their kids and some would go off to work, and then they'd rotate those responsibilities. Louise Michel also worked to find jobs for prostitutes who wanted to flee prostitution, and so they could have a job to prevent them from having to resort to that form of making money, which is of course very dangerous and unsafe, not to mention degrading for many women. So Louise Michel, you can understand now why she's such a colorful figure from the time of the French, or the Paris Commune rather. And as I'm looking at this slide right here, I'm really upset with myself because Michel is misspelled. That's how we spell Michel. Her last name is spelled M-I-C-H-E-L, no L-E on the end of it. Hey, sorry about that, guys. I missed that. I'm embarrassed, so let me move on to the next slide. Amazingly, Louise Michel survived the Paris Commune. Like most of the communards that were captured, she had to face trial for treason against France. And in her trial, she defended all of her actions. She said she was just in her revolutionary actions, but she said she was a revolution, and she dared the judge to issue the death sentence to her. Why the judge didn't issue the death sentence to her, I don't know enough to say why. I do suspect that the fact that she was a female might have had something to do with it. She's just such a revolutionary, different figure and such a non-traditional female at this stage in history that it seems likely that her gender might have prevented her from going to the gallows. In much the same way that the first time in our country's history that Susan B. Anthony cast a vote and she was breaking the law by voting, the police officer he couldn't even bring himself to put Susan B. Anthony in handcuffs. He's like, you just don't do this to a woman. And I wonder if the same sort of social forces were in play with Louise Michel. Okay, but what happened to Louise Michel? Well, of the communards that were captured and not executed when the French army went in during the Bloody Week, 20,000 of those communards were sentenced to death. That's a lot. That's a pretty big number, executing 20,000 people. 10,000 were deported. Louise Michel was one of these deportees. Where was she deported to? A place called New Caledonia, which is an island in the South Pacific off of the coast of Australia that was owned by the French. So she went way down there. That voyage took 4 months from France to New Caledonia. And then there were 6,000 more communards who were imprisoned in France. 10 years later, the French government forgave all of the communards and allowed all of them to come back to France. And Louise Michel did, where she, no surprise, continued her revolutionary activities, leading worker strikes and advocating for her new political belief, which was anarchism, which was a growing political movement in the late 19th century. And what made it a growing political movement is that there were so many desperate people who really didn't see any way out of their situation. They saw the wealthy industrialists working hand in hand with governments that supported them and oppressed the people, and the anarchists believe in the destruction of all of these systems. Get rid of governments, get rid of the economic system that creates these economic classes. Some of the anarchists were violent, and those are the ones that are going to sort of shape history. Most of them were not violent. They just believed in the destruction of these traditional systems, these traditional power establishments. But because there were so many desperate people in the late 19th century in Europe and also in the United States, that desperation and that belief in anarchism will lead a significant number of people to commit acts of violent terrorism. There'll be quite a few anarchist-inspired assassinations in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the President of the United States, William McKinley from Canton, Ohio, assassinated by an anarchist in September of 1901. Okay, so Louise Michel. Hey, and there's her name spelled correctly again for you. Sorry about that on the previous slide. Okay, so there were many people who were inspired by the Paris Commune and who studied what happened there very closely. Here's one person who studied the Paris Commune very closely and was really interested in why it failed and could it have succeeded. And that man was Vladimir Ulyanov, the middle-class, well-educated, revolutionary Russian, who will later on adapt the name Lenin, and he will successfully lead the Russian Revolution and establish the world's first communist state, the USSR, beginning in October of 1917. So how did Lenin see the Paris Commune? Well, he saw the commune, he saw the weakness of the commune as the people there being too disorganized. There was too much democracy and there wasn't enough organized defense. He believed the commune could have succeeded had the people been organized and had a more powerful military defense. It couldn't have been just a bunch of soldiers gathered together setting up barricades, each taking turn defending the barricade. For him, there needed to be more military organization. Now he's going to remember this because when he and Leon Trotsky lead the Red Revolution in Russia and starting in St. Petersburg, Russia, in 1917, he's going to carry with him this knowledge, this lesson of the Paris Commune, that he can't just set up the Soviet Union and say, okay, now everybody's free and equal, but rather he's going to establish this dictatorship, because for him, it has to be a dictatorship, or else it will fail. So you can create equality, you can create a society of equals, but it cannot be a free-for-all. It must be a dictatorship. So that'll be the goal of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky when they lead the Russian Revolution in 1917. We will learn about that later. Now, let's go back to Germany. The German Empire has been created. All right, so finally, back to Germany. There it is. A nice map of Germany in German. The German Empire is made up of many states, but they are all ruled by Prussia. But now the Reichstag is accepting representatives from all over the new German Empire. And a new Reichstag building is being constructed to accommodate all these representatives from the German Empire. And now that it's been created, the time has come for Germany to become an industrial powerhouse. So here are some interesting figures that give you a sense of how Germany is growing and how by the time we get to the early 20th century, the rest of the world is looking at Germany going, uh-oh, you may start dominating the world based upon your industrial output alone. So let's compare Germany to the industrial capital of the world, the United Kingdom, where the Industrial Revolution began. In 1871, when Germany unites at the dawn of the German Empire, Germany's industrial output is 1/100th that of the United Kingdom, that little island country up there north of the Channel. 1/100th that of the United Kingdom. Fast forward over a generation later, 1914, which is the year the First World War started, and Germany's industrial output is double that of the United Kingdom. Clearly, in that German Empire, their resources were being utilized, individuals were being put to work because they're breaking down all the political barriers in between the German states. Now it's easier to transport goods, sell goods, whatever. Germany is now a force to be reckoned with. But understand, as Germany industrializes, you've got more and more workers moving to cities. These workers have tough lives. Doesn't matter if you are in England or in Germany or in Pittsburgh in the United States of America. It's tough to be a steel worker. It's dangerous work. You get paid very little. And so naturally, in Germany, just like everywhere else, you've got trade unions that are forming and you have a growing socialist party. And there's nothing legally that says that a socialist political party can't form in Germany and have representatives elected to the Reichstag to begin directing the government. And I guess by directing the government, more specifically, passing legislation to benefit and protect the workers over the managerial and industrial, the managerial and owner class of society. So the owners and the managers of the factories. Okay, hopefully that's clear. All right, so Bismarck is now going to go from the statesman who's sort of the warrior provoking other countries. Now that he's created Germany, he's pretty much done. In 1871, he's done with offending or upsetting any other countries outside of Germany. And in 1884 and 1885, he actually oversees one of the most important peace conferences in European history to stop a major European war from happening. Okay, but for now, after 1871, Bismarck focuses on Germany, and he sees problems brewing up from within, namely two groups of people, Catholics and socialists. So Bismarck makes it his goal from here on out to not necessarily get rid of Catholics and socialists. I mean, especially the Catholics, you can't really stop people from being Catholic, but he does want to strip away any political power that the Catholics and the socialists may have or want to have. He wants to make Catholics and socialists an insignificant political force in his German Empire. So beginning with the Catholics, he's going to go after them first and then the socialists next. And the term that came around to describe Bismarck's attack on the Catholics was a term that's still around today, Kulturkampf, which is the German word for culture war. In that phrase, culture war, or the original German, Kulturkampf, we still see used quite frequently today. Okay, so let's talk about the Catholics first. Pope Pius IX is still the Pope, and he had proclaimed something called papal infallibility, which meant that he, as the Pope, could never be wrong. And what he says goes for all the Catholics in the world. Bismarck doesn't trust Catholics, and this might be a cultural thing in Germany, because in Germany, the northern Germans are predominantly Protestant. I mean, Martin Luther was a German. The Protestant Revolution started in Germany. Most of the Prussians are Lutheran, although there are a wide variety of Protestant groups in Germany, especially by the late 19th century. But those Protestant groups are all in the northern part of Germany. The south, especially Bavaria, still mostly Catholic. And Bismarck is simply suspicious that the Catholics are not real Germans, that they will somehow be more obedient to the Pope and more faithful to the Pope than they will to the new German state. So in the early 1870s, 1873, Bismarck encourages conservative members of the Reichstag to introduce a series of laws called the May Laws. And what the May Laws did was put the Catholic churches in Germany under the control of the German government. So part of these May Laws were, if you wanted to be a priest in Germany, you had to go through essentially a civil service education provided to you by the German state, and then and only then could you be allowed to be a priest in the German Empire. So now many of the Catholics, and they live down mostly in the south in like Bavaria, they see this as, okay, the German government, which is Prussian, which is run by a Prussian aristocrat, this Junker, Otto von Bismarck, he's forcing the priests to be educated or go through this civil servant education program. And if they don't, then they don't get to be priests. This is seen as, well, what it was, the German government trying to control the priest and tell them, or at least make sure that those priests are obedient to the German government and not to the Pope. Okay, so I hope I explained that clearly. And for the priests and the Catholics, this was very upsetting and aggravating. The antagonism between the Prussians and the Bavarians is this little north-south conflict that's going on. And the Catholics are put in this position where they're essentially forced to choose who they are most obedient to, the German government or the church and the Pope in Rome. And Bismarck has essentially pushed them into a corner with the May Laws, forcing them to make a decision. So what happens? Well, the Catholics in the South had their own political party. They were called the Catholic Center Party. They obviously don't like the May Laws. They don't like Otto von Bismarck. And so many of the people in the Catholic Center Party, the leadership of the Catholic Center Party, started drifting over, creating political ties with the German Socialist Party. So the Catholics and the Socialists are starting to join forces because they're united by a common enemy, which is Otto von Bismarck. So Bismarck starts to feel that he's creating an even bigger problem, so he decides to relent. And most of the May Laws were overturned. The only thing that remained was Catholics were not allowed to hold high office in the German government. The only people who were allowed to have a high office in the German government were Protestants, no Catholics. It also excluded Jews. Okay, so in his first culture war, in his first Kulturkampf against the Catholics, he essentially tried to put the Catholics under the control of the German government, and he failed. This culture war, he lost. Okay, so doesn't do that well against the Catholics. Let's see how well he does against the socialists. So in Germany in the 1870s, you have the SPD, which is the German Democratic Socialist Party. This particular political party is not a revolutionary Marxist communist party. They do not believe in the violent overthrow of government. They are democratic socialists, which mean that they believe in being voted into office, that they will represent the majority of the people who are working class people, and they will introduce progressive legislation to provide protection and good opportunities for the lives of the working class people who make up the majority of Germany. But Bismarck sees the SPD as an incredible threat to the German Empire, and he really became obsessive with destroying the SPD entirely. He saw them as destructive to the German economy, the German traditional way of life, and so he just aims at getting rid of this political party. So he tried to do it in 1878. He had the Reichstag pass a series of laws. I don't know exactly how many they were, but they were the anti-socialist laws. There had been two assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm I. The two people who had attempted to kill Kaiser Wilhelm I had no association with the SPD. Bismarck just simply proclaimed those guys were socialists. And using that fear-mongering of anti-socialism, he was able to encourage the representatives in the Reichstag to pass the anti-socialist laws of 1878. And what the anti-socialist laws of 1878 said were, quite simply, in my own summary, it is now illegal to have a socialist party. So socialist, or any political organization who identified themselves as socialist, be they a moderate democratic socialist or a revolutionary socialist group, they had no freedom of assembly, they had no freedom of the press, they weren't allowed to gather together, and they weren't allowed to speak, and they weren't allowed to publish. And the German police were empowered to enforce these laws. So how did this work out? Well, it didn't work out well at all for Otto von Bismarck. As repressive as these laws were, you still have the working class in Germany. They still have the same issues. They're not going away. So even though the SPD doesn't have the ability to assemble or to publish, they're actually still there, and they're influencing members in the Reichstag. And the fact that the German government under Bismarck had been so heavy-handed in trying to destroy the SPD, that sort of fires them up and gets them to push even more for legislative reform. So for Bismarck, this drives him crazy because he wants to destroy the SPD. So then he decides to do something very interesting. And here's his mindset. He doesn't like the socialists because he sees the socialists as being these like social revolutionaries that are going to create a completely different society. They're going to overtax the rich. They're somehow going to destroy traditional German culture. Socialists are anti-nationalists in the mind of Bismarck. So he sees socialism as this threat, this major threat to Germany in this sort of abstract way. It's an economic threat, but it's also some sort of cultural threat. But Bismarck also believes that the average working class German man is in his heart conservative, and they don't really want to be supporters of the SPD. But Bismarck recognizes they do want safety and security in their own life. So here's what Bismarck does, and it's an amazing move politically. He thinks about why the average German worker is gravitating towards the Socialist Party, the SPD, and he thinks, well, it's because the SPD is saying, we're going to fight for you to have a better life. We're going to soak the rich a little bit and provide for you better wages, better working conditions. You're going to have a better home, more stable life. So Bismarck thinks, I can probably get quite a few men away from the Socialist Party and supportive of me and the other conservative German politicians if we give them just a little bit of what they want. So here he is, Otto von Bismarck, the emblem of German nationalism and German conservatism in the late 19th century. and he pushes the Reichstag to introduce and pass the most progressive social reform legislation in all of Europe. And he creates German state welfare, which was established in the 1880s under Bismarck and remains in Germany still today. So Bismarck encouraged the Reichstag to do this. 1. Establish a universal healthcare system for all Germans. This was introduced and passed in 1883. So now if you're German and you're sick, you go to the doctor, you don't have to worry about paying for it, the government pays for it. 2. Workers' comp. This legislation introduced and passed the following year, 1884. If you are hurt on the job and you cannot work or work for a period of time, it's okay. The government is going to pay your wages until you are able to go back to work again. 3. Old age and disability pension. So the disability pension, if you are permanently injured on the job, let's say you break a leg, lose an arm or something, working in a steel mill or doing other dangerous work, it's okay. The German government is going to take care of you and your family. And then old age pension is the most, for me, it's the most fun one to talk about. This is what we call in the United States Social Security. Bismarck and the Reichstag, when they passed this legislation, they said that for men aged 65 and older, they will receive direct financial assistance from the German government. You get a pension starting at age 65. Now, what's fun to talk about is, in determining that age 65, the German government chose an age that wasn't going to, drive the German government into bankruptcy. So they chose the age 65 because the average lifespan for a German man in the 1880s was 63. So as soon as you made it into your 60s, for most Germans, you're dead. But if you make it to 65, you get your pension. So I don't know, maybe that was your inspiration to keep living. Now, what's incredible about this is, speaking about the American Social Security, our system that we have, the Social Security Administration, hopefully you know this, was developed by President Franklin Roosevelt and Congress during the 1930s during our Great Depression. It was part of FDR's New Deal plan. And we chose the age of 65, not because we did any research in terms of how old people live, but we just simply used the German model. So this old age pension that the Germans set up in 1889 was simply copied by the Americans. And I think it was 1937, the Social Security Administration was set up. And of course, it's still what we have today. All right, so this is an amazing thing. Otto von Bismarck, this nationalist, this conservative, he presses forward all of this essentially socialist legislation, and it works. Many German workers simply lose interest in the SPD. The SPD doesn't go away, and it's still around in Germany today. But this is Bismarck, the master politician, who realizes that if we want to win over people from the other side, and we don't like the other side because we see the other side as being too radical, well, let's make some moderate legislation to get just enough people from the other side over to our side, showing that we care about you. And it worked. It made Otto von Bismarck extraordinarily popular. All right. So the creation of the German welfare state did nothing to slow down the industrial development of Germany. By the time we get to the dawn of the 20th century, Germany is the world's leading industrial state in terms of production per capita, surpassing the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And Germany was the leader of what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. So we've already studied the First Industrial Revolution, a period of time from the middle of the 18th century through the early 19th century, where industrialization involved first an agricultural revolution, then people moving to the cities, the development of steam power, which will run both factories and locomotives, and those are the things that define the First Industrial Revolution. Once we get to the Second Industrial Revolution, the major developments are electricity, chemistry, the internal combustion machine, which is an automobile, which is different from the external combustion machine, which is the locomotive engine. So, in other words, cars come around in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The mass production of steel. Steel had always been around, but being able to produce large quantities of steel was impossible before the late 19th century, and then the development in the early 20th century of assembly line production. All of these are elements of the Second Industrial Revolution. And the Second Industrial Revolution is very important to history. Before I focus on Germany again specifically, Second Industrial Revolution is very important to history because not only do we have new jobs and new developments like with this Industrial Revolution, but this Second Industrial Revolution influences the lives of ordinary people. So if you really want to see the effects of the Second Industrial Revolution, go into your kitchen. Your kitchen is filled with the fruits. Well, maybe I shouldn't use the word fruits. Your kitchen is filled with the products of the Second Industrial Revolution. Refrigeration, electricity, electrical lights, canned food, pharmaceuticals, drugs, and then pretty much all of the utensils are the product of assembly line production. Also the products of assembly line production, look down at the clothes that you're wearing right now. Likely all that stuff rolled off of an assembly line somewhere in the world. And the Germans dominated the Second Industrial Revolution. Just a few examples of these. The men who developed the first internal combustion machine, the first car engine, Gottlieb Daimler, and Carl Benz. In terms of pharmaceuticals, there was probably no bigger pharmaceutical company than the Bayer company in Germany. Better living through chemistry. Now, in his quest to make Germany competitive with every other country in the world, there's one thing that the Germans didn't do, and this made Germany rather unique as a country in the late 19th century. They didn't really care about imperialism. Many European countries, especially the powerful ones, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, in the late 19th century, they initiated a second wave of imperialism. Europeans taking over countries around the world, countries that did not have the technology to resist the European invasions. And the Europeans went in with their social Darwinist philosophy of might makes right, and sometimes they went in with good intending missionary zeal that they were going to provide religion and medicine and all the benefits of a modern westernized society to these people who otherwise didn't have it. There was this second wave of imperialism that happened in the late 19th century, and the Germans wanted nothing to do with it. Bismarck had convinced Kaiser Wilhelm I that this is not beneficial. Europeans seem to be in this very competitive struggle to see who could create the biggest empire. Bismarck saw this competition as something that was irrational and non-beneficial. So very similar to Bismarck during the war against Austria, holding Kaiser Wilhelm I back and saying, no, you don't need to take over Vienna. It'll be more of a pain and more of a headache if you do, even though we can. It was very similar to that in his mindset. He did not see imperialism as something that was going to benefit the Germans at all. But the rest of Europe, they were in a struggle that was called the Scramble for Africa. And by the time we get to the year 1884, there is a potential of war breaking out, a major European war out of this competition and border disputes among the European countries as they take over Africa. Belgium in particular was posing a threat by taking over such a large area, the Congo. So Bismarck sees this potential for war and the devastation of this war, and this war will be good for nobody. So Otto von Bismarck summons the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. You can think of it sort of like the Congress of Vienna of 1814 to 1815, where representatives from all over Europe get together to try to secure a lasting European peace. But this is, of course, different. Nobody here at the Berlin Conference in 1884 is worried about Republican revolutions threatening the stability of Europe. Now the problem is European countries are getting ready to fight each other over land in Africa and who controls what in Africa. So literally Bismarck, who is this impartial third party because Germany has no interest in colonizing Africa, but Germany doesn't want to see a European war break out. So at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, all these European powers get together, all of these white men, and they divide up Africa. They decide who gets what the borders are going to be. King Leopold II of Belgium says that the Congo is international territory that everybody can come and go from freely. And with the Berlin Conference, Disputes are settled by the year 1885, and we have peace among the European powers. Now, let it be said that there was not a single African represented at the Berlin Conference, and even though it creates peace among the European powers, the Berlin Conference can also be seen as a very important example of European racism, European imperialism, social Darwinism, and European white supremacy. But from Bismarck's perspective, he's just trying to stop a war. Now, even though Otto von Bismarck stopped one European war from happening, he predicted another one. He didn't like what he saw happening in southeastern Europe, in the Balkan Peninsula. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing, shrinking and losing many states that it once controlled in the Balkans. And you had these new states appearing on the map: Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia. But in some of these cases, as soon as the Ottomans let them go, the Austro-Hungarians came along to gobble them up. And the Balkans just seem to be a very volatile area. Little Serbia thinks it should be a lot bigger and encompass all the areas where the Serbians live. Serbia doesn't like that right next door there's Bosnia, which is taken over by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there's the principal city in Bosnia of Sarajevo, and there's a lot of Serbians who live in Sarajevo. And then the Serbians think that they too might be the next country gobbled up by the Austro-Hungarian Empire as that empire spreads down into the Balkans. So because the Balkan area is so volatile, people refer to it as the Balkan powder keg. And Otto von Bismarck famously proclaimed, if there is going to be another European war, it will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. Many people credit Bismarck for having predicted the First World War. In the year 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm I died, and his son Kaiser Wilhelm II assumed the throne and becomes Germany's next and last emperor. Kaiser Wilhelm II was very different from Otto von Bismarck. Kaiser Wilhelm II was very influenced by an English writer named Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who in his writings proclaimed that the Anglo-Saxon people, the Germanic people, who are of course the German people, and the English people, or at least many of the English people, they are a superior master race. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was very influenced by these ideas, the writings of Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Kaiser Wilhelm II believes in German imperialism. So in 1890, when Kaiser Wilhelm II became Germany's next emperor, his first order of business was to fire Otto von Bismarck. And Kaiser Wilhelm II begins the process of creating a German imperial presence in Africa and making threatening moves to intimidate the other European powers, especially those of Britain and France. Kaiser Wilhelm II will have no problem in leading Germany into a war. But old man Bismarck is gone in 1890. And so there it is, students. And this ends my lecture on Otto von Bismarck and the creation of Germany. And as always, hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.